Hit the play button, it's time to go. Adrian Mouat's got insights to show. Cloud native ways, we'll delve and dive. On this episode, we're feeling alive. This is my journey, where stories unfold. Adrian Mouat's got insights to show. Cloud native ways, we'll delve and dive. On this episode, we're feeling alive. Fifth zero to hero with cloud in hand. Tech revelation.
Welcome back, everyone, to my journey where we explore the fascinating stories of cloud-native pioneers and community builders. I'm your host, Steve Wade, and today we're joined by someone whose impact on the container ecosystem starts right from Docker's earliest days and continues to shape how we think about container security. Welcome to the show, Adrian. You're on mute.
Oh, that was a good start. Hi there. I was saying thank you very much for having me.
No problem. Hopefully you enjoyed the AI-driven intro music there.
Yeah, that was quite a... I don't have the words for it yet.
A special intro.
Yeah.
So I want to start back, kind of right back at the beginning, right? So your parents said that getting you a ZX Spectrum when you were 4 or 5 years old was the beginning of the end. So what memories do you have of those early days?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, so they said that basically because that was my main toy or focus from that point on. So yeah, I mean, I played a lot of things like Dizzy. I played a lot of text adventures. Did you ever do those?
Yeah.
You know, the ones you typed in. So one of my favorite I remember at primary school. So I was still like, you know, it was really a bit beyond me at primary school, but I did a project on computer games, and I wrote to various computer game companies, and they wrote back. So like, I remember Codemaster sent me a bunch of stuff, but also Zenobi, who did all these text adventure games, and they were, yeah. So I always had a soft spot for Zenobi, which is probably a company nobody has heard of, but they did all these games like Balrog, and
What was your favorite game?
yeah, well, I love the Dizzy games. I can't really remember. I play a lot of those. The Balrog text adventure games. What else? Oh, Chaos. You ever play that Chaos game? That was great. That was also on the SD.
I did not.
Battle of Wizards. It was very simple, but it was, yeah, that was a lot of fun. Multiplayer.
Do you still get to play now, or not so much?
No, rarely. My nephew, we have an Xbox Series S, so my nephew plays it. But nearly all the time, what he does is he plays FIFA and he makes characters. He like, you know, he sits ages tweaking a character to look like Messi or someone.
That's hilarious.
Must then play the game.
I play FIFA, obviously, from a football background, so I can respect that. But I don't have the time to tweak these characters. It's a rabbit hole.
Yeah,
so
it's his favorite part of the game.
Wow, wild. So how did your journey progress from the ZX Spectrum to like the Atari and the Pentium 90?
Yeah, I don't know. There's too much to say there. So the Atari ST was great. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's just a more powerful version of the Spectrum or whatever. But loads a lot faster, thankfully. The one I tell you what, the game I really remember from the Atari ST was Dungeon Master. That was fantastic.
Now that is a serious game.
Yeah, yeah. And the Pentium 90, yeah, that was. Do you know I made a mistake with that? So I was quite late to the Atari ST and to the PC, and the reason being that it would take forever for me to convince my dad to get a new computer. And I did make a mistake. It's like if we'd waited like 2 or 3 more months with the PC, I would have got one with Windows 95 pre-installed, and I had a hell of a time trying to get Windows 95 to work on the PC afterwards. So that was a mistake.
So that's a good memory to have, though, right? You'll look back and remember those days, maybe with less fondness.
Yeah.
So was this kind of passion and inquisitiveness around computers and how they worked kind of what drew you to pursue a computer science undergrad?
Yeah, I don't think there was ever too many doubts about what I was going to do at uni. I did do history and stuff at school, so I did consider that briefly, but there's not really as good job opportunities or anything there. So it
That
was
was my
always going to
least
be
favorite
computer
subject. So
science.
second only
history?
maybe to geography.
I know I enjoyed it. I don't know why. I guess it was all the World War One stuff and so on. That was
Yeah, I think now looking back, it was probably something that I should have listened to a lot more. But I was more interested in maths and computing and physical education and stuff like that. It just didn't grab my attention. But now, like when I'm watching things like University Challenge, I really wish that I spent more time listening to what the history teachers were saying. But alas, I just deal with pop culture and food and sport.
got bad news for you because I'm pretty sure the University Challenge is a bit beyond high school history.
Yeah, that's true. So I know you specialized in high performance computing in your masters. So can you kind of unravel what that exactly means and what you kind of specialized in there?
Yeah, and basically it meant parallel programming. So we were doing, we learned like how to do C and Fortran and write programs that scaled hugely on like what they called big iron at the time. So you got to remember, we're going back to about 2002. And yeah, it was all about taking advantage of big machines, so supercomputers, if you like. And at that point in time, we were probably just starting to move to things like, having multiple CPUs in a PC and hyperthreading and so on. So it was relatively, nearly everything up to that point was single threaded. Even Java, like, was a problem because Java programs were typically, what's a UI component again? Swing. Or maybe it's a precursor to Swing, was all like single threaded, which was an issue. So yeah, it was all about learning how to do multi-threaded programming, basically, or different ways of doing multi-threaded programming.
And you had some kind of hypothesis that you validated or invalidated as part of that?
I don't know about that. It was just all to do with. So it was very academic background. So a lot of the problems were things like protein solving, n-body problems, and simulations, things like that. So you do like. So one of the interesting things was it involved a scheduler. So you would submit your jobs to this. I don't know if you've used a supercomputer before, but the way it works is you generally have a batch scheduler. You submit your job to this batch scheduler. You say how many CPUs you want, and you wait for your turn, and then it'll eventually run your program across however many CPUs and give you the results. And that's exactly the same idea as we have in Kubernetes, but the schedulers were just different algorithms and actually probably more complex than a Kubernetes scheduler.
So you were doing scheduling before scheduling was what everyone was doing.
Yeah, well, I was using the scheduler. I didn't. Yeah,
didn't write the scheduler.
Yeah, I was swearing at it.
I think we all still do that now.
Yeah.
So, can you tell me about your internship at Sun Microsystems? Like, what was that? I'm assuming that was part of your degree.
Yeah, so this is before I went to. So I did my high performance computing MSc at University of Edinburgh, but before that, while I was still doing my undergrad at Heriot-Watt, then in a couple of the summers I did internships at Sun Micro. So Sun Micro, like I was studying in Edinburgh. Sun Microsystems had a big factory out in Linlithgow, which is just a few miles outside of Edinburgh. So I went there first. I think it must have been 2000. The summer of 2000, and this was still .com boom, and it was really busy, and I was asked to help out in this project that was in central test engineering, and everything was done in awk. I don't know if you ever used awk before, AWK, or our project was done in awk. A lot of other things were done in Korn shell, KORN.
Wow.
Which I mean, I've never seen that used before or since. It was also like my first exposure to Unix, because Linux existed by then, but was not common. So it was my first exposure to like Unix and Vim, and yeah, it was really interesting the first year. But the second year was a .com bust had happened, And Sun was really badly hit by a dot-com bust. It never recovered really, because what happened was in the dot-com boom, everybody was buying SunKit. But in dot-com bust, everybody sold their SunKit. So the market was flooded with like cheap Sun hardware. And yeah, it was a really bad time from Sun basically from that point. When I was there in the year 2000, Sun was talking about buying Oracle. Literally, they were talking about buying Oracle because everybody
Wow.
would buy SunKit and run Oracle on it. And yeah, so
What could have
it
been?
really turned. Yeah.
That's a good introduction to Unix though, starting with Orc and
Yeah.
Corn Shell, which I've literally heard of but never used.
Yeah. I have no idea why they use that everywhere. It seems, yeah, seems a bit odd.
Strange choice. So how did working at EPCC influence your perspective on the kind of intersection for academia and industry? And could you unwrap what EPCC means for everyone that doesn't know?
Yeah. So that's where I did my undergrad, my MSc was the Edinburgh Parallel Computing Centre. I think it just calls it or maybe it changed again, but it does just call itself EPCC now, I think, so that it has a broader remit than just parallel computing.
Mhm.
But yeah, so after I did my MSc, I worked in industry for a year, and then I actually went back to work for EPCC. And that was, yeah, it was a great time. The best thing there was just the people. There were some extremely smart people, as you can probably imagine, like academics that were exceptional at their jobs, but probably couldn't really cope with like pressures of industry or just didn't want to deal with politics and pressures of industry. So yeah, it was very interesting from that point of view. Although, having said that, like EPCC was intentionally between sort of academia and industry. It's an industry outreach department. So we did, projects with people like Rolls-Royce. Hope I'm allowed to mention that. And other people, and a lot of EU-funded projects because at that time we were still in the EU, and so I spent a lot of my time doing like travel to European projects and grid computing and things like that, which was very interesting.
Have you been back since?
To EPCC?
To speak to professors and people that you used to work with.
I was in contact with people on and off. I've not spoken to them for a while, I have to say, but yeah, on and off I was.
How long were you there, out of interest, when you went back?
Oh, I don't know. Let's look at LinkedIn. It must have been like 7 years. It was a long time. I was there.
Wow. Okay. So moving on further forward into more kind of cloud native topics, you're, in my mind, always known as Mr. Docker and then container security. So like, when did you first encounter Docker?
Yeah, so there was a company pre-container solutions called Ugly Duckling that I did some work with, which is Jamie Dobson and Penny Resnick were both there, who went on to found Container Solutions. And so Penny was the one that started looking at Docker. So it's all his fault, really.
That guy.
Yeah, and he showed it to me, and I was like, oh, wow, this is actually really interesting. And I think it was also, I found it at the right time. There was, what was that HashiCorp project? Well, I guess it was so Mitchell Hashimoto wrote this VM version of Docker effectively before Docker.
Vagrant?
What was that called? Yes, exactly, Vagrant. So I'd had experience of Vagrant. So like once you go from Vagrant to Docker, and it was like 1,000 times faster, but did a lot of the similar things. It was great to use, and I could also see like how it would have really helped me on projects I'd been working on. And you constantly in those days had the problem of getting something to work on your machine and then not working on somebody else's machine because there's different versions of libraries or something stupid like that. So it really was revolutionary at the time.
Yeah, I agree. I had a very similar experience. So I was doing a lot of .NET for my sins back in the day. And then, we were trying to provision things with Chef, and I was using Vagrant to kind of double check, and we would make sure that the Vagrant scripts would run locally, and then we'd have some kind of, elevated level of confidence that by the time that it got to AWS, it was actually going to work. And then, a good friend of mine, Matt Bentley, he worked for a startup that got bought by Docker, and he's like, you need to jump on this thing. it's orders of magnitude better than what you're currently dealing with. And I was like, oh, I don't know if I believe you. And he's like, well, I told you for a long time that Linux was what you should be using, and you're still on Microsoft, so don't make the same mistake twice. And then I was like, okay, fair enough. And then yeah, same as you, right? I saw it and I was like, this is blazing fast and ridiculously easy.
Yeah, that was it. It was like the user interface. You just type Docker run and you got something working. That was the amazing part. Docker run Nginx. Yes.
Yeah,
Totally.
yeah, I remember those days. What motivated you in that case to start or to write the using Docker book?
So I think what happened there is I'd written a blog on Python and Docker, and I think O'Reilly saw that because they reached out to me. I guess they saw how quickly Docker was taking off and wanting to get some books out. And yeah, so they asked me to submit a proposal, and I did, and it was taken forward. I guess it just sounded like something fun to do. I was at a period of my life where I didn't have many responsibilities, so I wasn't too worried about the money side of things, and it just sounded like a nice thing to do.
How long did it take to write? Can you remember?
Yeah, I have to. So one clever thing I did was I tried to reuse bits of it for like blogs and so on, and try and do a little sort of bit of consultancy around the things that I was looking at. But it was my main focus for most of a year, I think. So I was probably quite slow writer. I know other people do it alongside their main jobs and they get out quicker than that. So.
Yeah, I've been asked to do it a bunch of times, but I just know that it's going to suck so much time that I just don't know if I can do it. Yeah. If I was, go on.
Yeah, because you do want to commit some time to it. Yeah, and have ring fence time that you can use for it.
Yeah. So talking of interesting blog posts, right? You wrote an interesting comparison piece on Mesos, Swarm, and Fleet and Kubernetes. So how do you reflect on those early, I'll call them container orchestration wars, friendly fighting, should we call it, nowadays?
Yeah, well, it probably wasn't always friendly, although honestly, like there was a point, I remember like Mesos talked about running Kubernetes in Mesos and things like that.
I remember
and so when that happened, I guess Kubernetes had really won. Because when you're having to talk about how to use Kubernetes with your own project, they're in trouble. And Swarm, the problem with Swarm was they didn't have there's so many people behind Kubernetes at that point that Swarm could never keep up, especially when they had to do a rewrite of Swarm to Swarm v2.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah, and they could never catch up from that point. And Fleet, I think, had significant scaling issues. We got to remember, like, the people that designed Kubernetes, they had the background of Borg and Mesos. So they'd looked at both those projects, understood what worked about at Borg at Google and what worked about Mesos, which was used at Twitter at the time. And so they had all that context, and they built Kubernetes based on that context. So they had an unfair advantage, really.
Yeah, they did. And I remember, I think I've used all of them but Fleet. I remember hearing about Fleet, but I never actually used it. But I remember
they all did the same thing. There was like I wrote about them all in that book, and it was kind of boring. So it's just like different commands for running the container.
Yeah, I remember having Swarm in non-production, I think. Then we needed to scale out a service, and then we hit the port conflicts problem. And then I was like, this isn't going to work. What's running? And then it was like Kubernetes 1.2. And I was like, oh, like YOLO straight to prod, because we can't take Swarm to prod right now because we can't scale it.
Yeah.
So can you walk us through your journey at Container Solutions? Because that's probably where I came to know you.
Okay. I'm not really sure how to do it. I did a lot of stuff over those years there. I mean, a lot of blogs, consulting for various companies, a lot of training. I did a lot of training courses with Container Solutions. By the end, what I was doing was focusing on open source projects that we'll talk about in a second. I don't know, like you asked about key learnings was one thing you mentioned earlier, and I'm not sure what they'd be, but it's always about the people in the end. Like the reason I stayed there for so long, I guess, was just the people. There's some fantastic people to work with and learn from and with and so on. So it was a great journey there.
Yeah, I think the people are the most important thing when it comes to work, right? If you don't enjoy the people that you're working with, it's just the whole thing's a burden. Even if it's the coolest, craziest technology, like you're still not going to enjoy it as much as if you're working with a cool bunch of people. And I've been lucky enough in the past to have the same kind of thing as you, right? I had a really good core group that we were working with, and we ended up staying for many years, and then left when, like, I unfortunately I left, and then a bunch of people after me kind of left pretty quickly, which I guess is a good thing for me as a lead, that they came and joined me at the next gig.
Cool.
But yeah, it was. I think to your point, it's definitely all about the people. So yeah, you were saying that you maintained a number of open source projects. Like, I remember actually you were involved in External Secrets Operator, or External Secrets, I think it was called at the time. I don't even think it was called Operator. What other ones are kind of famous ones that you've been involved in?
So we'll just give a bit more background. What kind of happened at Container Solutions was we realized we had a lot of open source projects that people were doing when they weren't directly working with clients. And the problem was sometimes they'd have time to work on it, sometimes they wouldn't. So we wanted to kind of put a bit more coherency and structure behind it, with the view of hopefully turning like several of them into companies, or something like that anyway, making them, growing them. And so that's kind of what I was in charge of. It maybe never, at the time, it maybe never quite worked out as well as I wanted, mainly just because of budgetary constraints, I would say. But yeah, so I was also involved with Trio, which was the container registry project that I worked on. That was my main baby. There were other things. One thing that really took off at Container Solutions at the start was Mini Mesos. So Frank had written this Mini Mesos, which is basically a testing version of Mesos that did really well. We had to archive that in the end, though, because we just couldn't keep up with maintaining it. And I think that was part of the reason we wanted to take things a bit more seriously after that. So yeah, the External Secrets project, that wasn't, like, I had very little technical involvement with that. It was Ricardo that started that. Ricardo Cephala, and
Okay.
he, it started to take off, but he had no time left to work on it. And it was in danger of dying. Like, we just didn't have people to look at it. And eventually I got a new start at the time to Container Solutions, and I got him to agree to spend some time with it, and that was Lucas. And he was amazing, to be honest. Like, it took him some persuasion to make him believe he could sort of lead this project and get it somewhere, but he totally did. And it was good time, because actually what happened was there's another project I can't remember the name of, that was maybe even more advanced, but it's slightly different to the External Secrets project. So the two projects merged, and that became the External Secrets Operator.
Yeah, now Lucas does it full time, right? Am I right?
Yeah, I was about to say that. So Lucas and Gustavo, who are both at Container Solutions and did work on the External Secrets Operator, recently, as in this year, they launched a company to support the External Secrets Operator, which is amazing. And so I'm going to claim that my time supporting open source at Container Solutions was worthwhile, because this came out of it. But yeah, I can't claim any technical credit. The only credit I claim is like pushing Lucas and Gustavo maybe to look at it a bit.
Yeah, it's a cool project. I've used it for many years.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah,
cool.
It's
you probably know more about it than me, quite honestly.
Probably. I've read the code. So you spent time at Container Solutions, right? And then you started to get more heavily involved in kind of the evolution of security. So kind of what drove your interest for container security kind of early on?
Well, honestly, I was pushed into it, because what happened was, when I wrote the Docker book, I wrote a chapter on security. And again, people said you had to have a chapter on security. So I did it. But I'm always a bit scared talking about security, because I don't want to say something wrong and somebody like ends up in a bad security situation because of something that I said. Although that's, I don't know. I think people are actually smart enough to know that they need to do their own homework. So maybe I shouldn't worry about that as much as I do. But anyway, I wrote this chapter for the book on security that actually got pulled out into a separate ebook for O'Reilly, and that was like promoted by Nginx or someone, and given away at like conferences and so on. And that was so basically on the back of that, I was asked to do talks on security, and it kind of spiraled.
Then you became the expert.
Yeah, well, I still don't like calling myself an expert on security, but yeah, and a certain like container niche aspects of it, perhaps.
Yeah, I remember coming to a bunch of your talks on container security and specifically provenance as well.
Yeah, so you were maybe at the one that did at KubeCon 2018, which was all about image provenance and security in Kubernetes. I did do it at a few other places, so it might have been somewhere.
When was what city was 2018?
It was Copenhagen.
I was there, so possibly. Yeah, those were the days when they were small and you didn't feel like you were like.
Copenhagen was pretty big. Yeah.
Yeah, but
That was
like
a good
Paris
one.
was
I enjoyed that.
13,000, which is just wild.
I know.
Yeah, Copenhagen was pretty big actually. So, what kind of took you from? I'm trying to get this journey right. You were at Container Solutions, and then how did you did you go straight to Chainguard from there, or was there kind of a jump in the middle? Okay, you went directly.
Yeah.
And how did that kind of come about?
Yeah, well, from that talk in some ways, because in that talk about image provenance and security in Kubernetes at KubeCon, I asked more questions. I was basically complaining about issues in Kubernetes to do with provenance and knowing what you're running and signing and things like that. And then I noticed Chainguard and Sigstore, and they were actually solving some of the problems I was complaining about rather than just complaining about them. So I thought, okay. And I reached out to Dan Lawrence and had a chat with him. And excuse me. And then he said, go and talk to Kim Lewandowski, who's another one of the founders. And so I talked to her, and that was about it, really.
That's good though. Good little bit of outreach by yourself, and then look at that, landed.
Yeah.
Early days of Chainguard as well.
Yeah, it's a little bit more complicated to get a job now, I'm afraid.
So, talking of container security, right? I spent a bunch of time in that space. You're currently in it. Like, what would you say are some of the biggest challenges today in container? Let's talk container image security to kind of put a label on it.
Yeah, so some of the problems just still aren't fully solved. They're not. What's that quote? You know, the future's here, it's just not equally distributed.
Yeah.
So like signing still isn't entirely widespread. Like, and people certainly chicken signing isn't widespread. So I would like that to be just the default, which it perhaps will be one day. But I think the major thing is the supply chain security. So you can go and look at things like salsa levels, but that does tend to get it gets quite technical and down to the weeds, and you start talking about pretty serious adversaries like nation states and so on. But for most people, there's two things I talk about. One is keeping stuff up to date, so just making sure you're running like new versions of things. But the other one that I think is causing a lot of problems is just provenance. So like, knowing about the images that you're running, or not even images, like the libraries in your source code that you're using. So when you do like a Docker pull, how do you know you've got the right version of the image? Like you haven't typoed it and got like some version that a hacker's uploaded. And the same thing with npm install. And even then, like sometimes if you're doing like a Docker pull of a project, how do you know that the project hasn't been taken over by somebody you don't trust? And I think everybody's aware of the XZ, I'm trying not to say XZ, the XZ vulnerability that was, how long ago was that? Was that this year?
Yeah, this year.
Yeah, start of the year maybe. And so that was a crazy one where like, somebody that seemed to be a good contributor to the project turned out to be putting in malicious
yeah, that's nuts.
Commits.
That's a serious level of commitment.
Yeah. So I think those are the major challenges at the minute. But we are
Yeah,
starting to look at them. There's Chainguard, obviously, and there's also people like Stacklock trying to help out.
yeah. I think provenance is an interesting one. I think to your point, a lot of people are now signing images. Checking them is like the next obvious leap. So I've seen some people do that. Some people don't. They just say we sign them, so it's fine. Tick. And yeah, provenance is a really interesting one. I remember I was giving a training. When was it? Probably a couple of years ago, and I did something similar. So I spelled Nginx wrong. I put the X and the I the other way around, and everyone just pulled the container. And in the training, and I was like, look, actually, like, slow down and look at what you're doing. It was midway down like a list of things you had to do, and I was like, yeah, now run this locally with Docker run, copy paste, and I had just a fake Bitcoin miner that was running that would save dollars to a specific folder, and I was like, that's how easy it is for you to get owned. Like, you didn't do any checks at all, and we were checking above in previous steps, but you just thought, oh, because this is a well-known image, you're just not going to bother.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So I remember seeing your 2021 predictions blog, right? And you had, I won't spoil it, you had some exciting forecasts. Like, which ones do you think were the most accurate of that?
Well, the most accurate. Yeah. So, I mean, I think I did pretty well, to be honest. I'm relatively happy with that post. I think perhaps the one that was most controversial, or I was least sure about, was the one about moving workloads from the cloud back to local compute or data centers.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, now we have. I don't use the term cloud repatriation, so I think that term came about after the blog, but maybe it didn't. But anyway, it's become popular enough that there's a term for it. So I'm going to claim that cloud repatriation, which that was my biggest hit there. Yeah. So basically, the idea is, if you haven't heard about it, is cloud's too expensive. Let's move things back to a data center that we own. And people are seeing huge savings from that. I think it makes most sense where you have relatively stable, mature workloads. I mean, don't do it if you definitely want to be using the cloud if you're a startup, but maybe not if you're an enterprise that's always using the same 5 VMs and they're not even at 100%. You're probably just wasting money in the cloud.
Yeah.
Shouldn't say 5 VMs, same 500 VMs.
Yeah, I read it and I think you nailed most of them, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, the other big one, I mean, you got to remember, this was a few years ago. So I did talk about AI, and at the time we had like GPT-3 helpers that was kind of like autocomplete. And, I talk about advances there, but it did, it went crazier than I thought it would. Yeah. So that was lucky, if anything. WASM's quite an interesting one. I think I was pretty accurate there. I thought it might actually be bigger than it is, to be honest. I think it's really hitting the sort of stride in like plugin ecosystems. So using WASM for plugins is, just a no-brainer, really.
Yeah, we've got a SpinCube episode coming up on Thursday with Michelle from Fermion Tech, and I was kind of saying to her, I think if I was starting a project from zero, I think WASM makes sense, and I think if you're in a kind of, what's the word? If you're in a crunch in terms of dollars or pounds or whatever currency, and you're looking for cost savings, right? That ability to be able to move to like ARM easily and trivially comes out the box with WASM, whereas like trying to get certain containers to run on ARM is very, very difficult. So I think that would be the other arm, using the ARM analogy, to using WASM. But I think it's difficult right now for me as a consumer to be able to justify, oh, I have a bunch of microservices running in Docker. Do we kind of refactor them all to WASM? I don't think we're there yet.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. Yeah. But honestly, I think the things I got wrong are slightly more interesting in some ways. So I said that Rust would be more popular than Go, which is definitely not the case.
It's a wild accusation.
Well, at the time I wrote that, it was definitely like on it, it was accelerating in usage, and people were talking about moving C to Rust. And I think Rust isn't going anywhere. It's a fantastic language and it will get more adoption, but it's more complex to learn than Go. So I think Go, it's going to struggle to touch Go for a while, I think. So I definitely got that one wrong. The other one that I'm sad I got wrong was about Kubernetes. I said a Kubernetes rival would would emerge. I think I still got maybe a year left or 2 years left on
Yeah,
this.
you've got a little bit of time.
But yeah, that's not happened yet. I thought that might happen. Maybe the rival is just. I think what we're actually saying is platform engineering. So people building on top of Kubernetes as opposed to replacing it. And where they are replacing it, they may be replacing it with serverless or Google Cloud Run, things like that.
Yeah, I listened to a talk from Kelsey this year about Kubernetes, and he was saying something along the lines of, I do think there is going to be a natural competitor, but it just hasn't come out yet. And maybe that's an architectural competitor rather than a kind of re-platforming competitor. The architecture will define the platform rather than the platform redefining the architecture. And I think maybe Wasm will end up doing some of that potentially.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to watch anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Are we going to all have to learn a new style of platform in the next couple of years? Watch this space. So, where do you see kind of supply chain security heading in the next couple of years? You kind of mentioned that.
Yeah, I don't think I've got a better answer. I think it probably is to do with like helping people judge the provenance of things. And there must be something about AI here as well, but maybe AI actually plays a role in helping people make sure they're using trustworthy components. But I think that's the main part. There's also like these SALSA frameworks. I don't know if you've seen SLSA. It's just a framework for trying to figure out how good your supply chain security is. I think what will probably happen is we'll have another major breach like SolarWinds or something, and we'll go back to taking it more seriously again. It seems to wax and wane how interested people are in supply chain security.
Yeah, I think so. I think there'll be another breach and loads of people will get owned, and then it will become really important for the next 6 months, and then it will just kind of go under the radar and we'll go and do other things.
Yeah. I mean, to be fair, like enterprise companies are always interested in security companies.
It's true.
One reason, I guess it gives companies a way to say, hey, we are doing something about this.
Yeah, it gives them the warm and fuzzies, I call it. So we've talked a little bit about container security. I want to kind of switch gears now to like your speaking journey, right? Because you're a very well-known speaker. I've seen you speak a bunch of times. Always entertaining and interesting conversations and topics that you bring. But I remember when we were putting your bio together for this, that you mentioned that your first presentations at Parallel Computing were challenging. Like, why were they challenging, and kind of what did you learn from them?
Yeah, I mean, it's because I'm a bit of an introvert and I found it very difficult public speaking to begin with. I did relatively quickly get better. One of the major issues I had, and arguably still have, and listeners will probably complain on the podcast, but I used to be far worse in terms of being understood. Like people really struggle with my accent, especially when I was talking in Europe. So I was part of like a European project, and I would go to give an update on what we were working on, and people picked up every fifth word or something. It wasn't a great situation. So yeah,
I wouldn't say you have your elocution is good. From a number of Scottish people that I have worked with previously, and I had a similar experience than what you were saying, right? I remember a gentleman from a well-known company. I think it was in Edinburgh. I'm not going to call him or the company out. Very similar, very senior guy was speaking, and I was talking to someone last week. I was saying I actually had to have a junior member of staff, like kind of as an intermediate translator, because I genuinely couldn't understand what he was saying. But yeah, I can understand everything you're saying.
But I also felt, is guilty the right word? But, I felt bad because in Europe, I was speaking to people that spoke, at least two languages, sometimes 4 or 5 languages, and they couldn't understand me that only speaks one language. So
And
yeah, I did feel
I guess
bad.
that's kind of what motivated you to work with the speech coach, was off the back of that.
To be honest, I only did that recently.
Okay.
I guess the main reason being it's not necessarily very cheap, so it's not accessible to everybody. Um, Although I'm sure there are programs you can do, and you can still go on YouTube and you will find exercises and so on that you can help do to work on. But I did recently work with somebody called the speech coach, and it did help a lot with cutting out some things and being clearer with certain words and so on. And I should, to be honest, go back and practice that more. But yeah, it definitely was helpful to me. So thank you, Vinny.
Oh, you went to Vinny?
Yeah, do you know who that is?
Yeah, I know who that is. Yeah, he's an interesting guy. He was the person that told me when you're practicing a talk. I don't know, he may have taught you this as well, that there's 3 ways of practicing a talk. So the first one, essentially you record yourself, and then after you've recorded yourself, you do this 3-step process. So firstly, you don't look at what you're saying, and you turn the phone upside down and you just play it, and you're basically listening to your voice and how your voice is progressing, and you're undulating over time, and like what are the filler words, etc., etc. So that's like kind of phase 1. Then phase 2 was you turn the sound all the way down and watch yourself, and like look at hand gestures and how you kind of holding yourself at the lectern, and are you moving around, etc., etc. And then the third one is you translate on paper what you've said and then read it back to yourself, because that's what they're. And then it was fascinating when he told me to do this, because the third one didn't make any sense to me. Like I was like, why would I do that? That's a heck of a lot of words that I'm going to have to write. And he was like, once you write it, you'll understand the flow, and then maybe you'll reposition what your key message is, because actually you're waffling 3/4 of the way through the talk and it's not really going anywhere. So you could cut all that out because you're not progressing to the key message. So yeah, I've used it a bunch of times. It's actually a pretty interesting and useful technique. So if you haven't done it before, I'd recommend it.
Cool. Yeah, he helped me with some like specific presentations as well. My big problem is you never have the time to work on a presentation as much as you would like to.
It's true.
But
yeah, it's always. I'm lucky enough to not be the kind of people that are like writing it and finishing it before they're going on stage.
No, I try not to do that. Absolutely. I am guilty of working on the tech side of it, like the research side, longer than I should, and I should spend more on the slides and the presentation.
So what advice would you give to engineers who want to improve their speaking skills?
Yeah, well, I think the first thing I would say is that doing public speaking or talking about stuff really helps your career. Like it really will help you get in front of people, help you with networking, and new opportunities will suddenly appear. And yeah, trust me. So speaking will really help your career if you get into it. And the way to get into it is simply to go and talk to a local meetup. Like most of us live in cities or near to a city, and they will have a CNCF meetup or a Python meetup or something like that. And those meetups will be crying out for speakers. You'll be able to go and do a talk, even if it's just a 5-minute lightning talk. There'll be no pressure. Nobody's going to say anything bad to you. Everybody will be on your side and helping you forward. So that's what to go and do. To get better requires rehearsing and going back through things and using techniques that you just talked about.
Yeah, I agree with the going to the meetups is the best one, right? I remember the first ever public talk that I did at a meetup, and it was, looking back now, it was absolutely horrific. Somehow I managed to get a job out of it, which actually blows my mind and proves your point.
Yeah, exactly.
I was like, this is god awful. Like, why do you want to hire me? It was like a 30-minute talk. I'd finished in 12 minutes and just stood at the lectern waiting for people to ask me 18 minutes worth of questions. Yeah, I wanted the ground to swallow me up. But yeah, I agree with you. Like, practice
You'd
makes
obviously
perfect.
proven that you knew what you were talking about, though. So
Yeah, that's true. I had the battle scars. Maybe they just didn't get portrayed well enough. But yeah, I agree. Like, public speaking's helped me massively.
Yeah.
So I want to go into a new segment now called the lightning round, which is essentially where I'm going to ask you a bunch of questions and you've got to answer quickly. Like, we won't have a long ramble, and I'm going to ask all the guests this moving forward. So, favorite container orchestration platform today, excluding Kubernetes?
So I run Docker Compose on like my home office stuff. So I'll say Docker Compose. I realize it's only single node, but
that'll count. One prediction you're making for the next 5 years?
Yeah, we're going to get. I said it before. We're going to get another like large hack like SolarWinds.
Go to resource recommendation for getting started with containers.
So I know a whole bunch of people like Brett Fisher, James Buren, Nigel Poulton. They all do like courses on Docker and Kubernetes and stuff that are great to pick out. Probably the most beginner friendly is Brett Fisher stuff, and that's on Udemy. So yeah, go check that out.
Yeah, shout out to those guys. I know Nigel. I actually don't know the other two, or maybe I do and I don't recognize the names. Surprising thing that you've learned in your cloud native journey so far?
Just how small the tech world is. Like I'm always bumping into the same people. I know the same faces. I don't understand how it's so small given like how many millions of developers there are in the world.
Agreed. And if you could go back and give yourself one piece of advice when starting with containers, what would it be?
I forgot to answer. I don't have been prepared for this. Starting with containers. Don't. No, that's a lie. The thing is, I want to give advice that stops you spending so long in the weeds, but I enjoyed spending so long in the weeds. So maybe that's it. Go deep with part of it. Go deep. There you go.
Yeah, learn how C groups work.
There you go. That's good.
Cool. I've spent 45 minutes asking you a bunch of questions. Do you have any for me before we wrap up?
That's you've thrown me there. Don't know. What's your prediction for the future?
Well, I'll tell you what I'm intrigued with. I'm intrigued to see how AI integrates with platform engineering. And I don't mean like just prompting and we'll just get, it will help people write, Golang code better. It can do that already, right? I'm like, what can it do? If we just take Kubernetes as an ecosystem, what can it do for Kubernetes? Like, can we get super advanced auto scaling that knows that Black Friday is coming and just automatically scales up? Or the reverse, right? Oh, you're spending X amount of resources when you don't need to, so I'm going to scale you down, therefore helping your bottom line.
I'm sure there was half a dozen AI SRE companies at KubeCon, so it'll be interesting to see like where they evolve to. There won't be. I think there'll be like half that number next year, but we'll see what happens.
Yeah, and I think to that point, the next one, and I've talked about this before, is like I think there needs to be a serious amount of consolidation, because like as a new joiner into this ecosystem, it's like, where do you begin? Like if you just look at the cloud native landscape, there's tens of tools that do the same thing, and it's like, how do I work out and distinguish which one of these is the best? And obviously they have that kind of tiering system with graduated, incubated, etc. But if you're interested in one of the sandbox ones, how do you distinguish the best sandbox project when there's 5 of them for the thing that you care about? And I think go on.
I was going to say, do you think platform engineering is a response to that?
I think they have to be responsible for that to some degree, yeah. And I think we have to get to a position whereby, like, Kubernetes is the boring layer, but I think we need to go one above that, and we need to start having certain types of workloads that are always running on our Kubernetes clusters that just make things work, and they just become boring. And then we can start focusing on what we should be focusing on, right, which is the business value. And then all of the kind of what I would call the platform engineering bits around the side of that. But we shouldn't be trying to work out, like, what monitoring stack do we run? Because there's so many options and so many people are opinionated, and then you just get into this fight and tug of war, and then someone wins and someone loses. And I think there just needs to become this kind of de facto way of doing it. I know that that's kind of an epiphany because it will never exist because these companies are constantly churning stuff out and want their one to win. But I do think there needs to be some kind of consolidation. And what else? I think Kubernetes has a shelf life in the next 5 years or so. I don't know what it's going to be replaced with, but I think something's coming. I just don't know what it is yet.
Yeah. Okay. You're doing my prediction again.
I honestly
The
do
next 5
think
years.
I do think it's coming though.
Good.
I will watch this space. I think we're all going to have to start learning something else soon. Cool. And if you don't have any other questions, that kind of brings us to an end, right? It was a super fascinating journey. I've known you for a while. We talk semi often at conferences, but I've never actually had the chance to sit down and talk to you for an hour. So yeah, thanks for your time. It was super insightful.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, and I specifically kind of loved how you shared about your evolution as a speaker, right? And those kind of early days of struggling and what it takes to get to where you are now, right? And you're a very accomplished speaker, and I've seen you, like I said before, speak a number of times, and you've spoken probably in front of tens of thousands of people now. The ones I remember is probably a little bit smaller than that.
Yeah. So that was KubeCon. That was a fun one.
Yeah, and how can people get in contact with you if they want to? What's the best way of doing that?
So I have a relatively unusual surname, spelled Mouat. So you can generally find me quite easily on various platforms. There is now, annoyingly, a curling guy in Scotland called Bruce Moat, and he competes for me for Google Space. But yeah, you should find me on Twitter, on Blue Sky, on YouTube. I honestly, most of the stuff that I'm putting out now is either on the Chainguard YouTube channel or the Chainguard blog. So that's the other places to look.
Best place to find you. I was actually going to ask you at the end, how you pronounce your surname.
I say Moat. Some people say, I'm from Shetland, and there's different pronunciations up there. So some people say Moat, and some people say Moat.
I was going to say Moat.
I say Moat.
But Moat's easier for an elocution perspective. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's great. Thanks very much for your time today, Adrian. Always insightful. And yeah, I'm Steve Wade. This has been my journey. And remember, whether you're starting with your first container or you're architecting some complex cloud native system, every expert was once a beginner, and every journey starts with that first step. You just got to take it. Thanks for listening, everyone, and I'll see you next week.